Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I'm Matt Levitt, Director of the Reinhardt Program on Counterterrorism and Intelligence and the Fromer Wexler Senior Fellow, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today to a conversation with Carter Burwell, who is the Senior Advisor, Counselor to the Secretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, formerly served as Chief Counsel to Senator John Cornyn on the Senate Judiciary Committee, and before that was a prosecutor with the Department of Justice in several different capacities. And we're going to have a conversation about Treasury's expanding toolkit, the evolving national security threat landscape. Carter, it's a pleasure to have you here with us. I appreciate your taking the time out of your busy schedule. And let me turn it over directly to you for your opening remarks. People should know that they are able to submit questions for this event to the email address policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. Carter, after your opening remarks, you and I will engage in a kind of fireside chat guided by some of my own and some of the questions that will come in off the email. Thank you in advance. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much, and good morning to everyone out there. As Matt mentioned, my name's Carter Burwell, and I serve as Counselor to the Secretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence at the United States Department of the Treasury. I'm sorry to be giving these remarks remotely and that we could all not be together in person, but in this unusual time of virtual events and social distancing, it is nice to see so many people gathered together who are interested in the Treasury Department's national security efforts. I want to thank the Washington Institute and especially you, Matt, for inviting me to speak and for that kind introduction. For years, the Washington Institute has put out tremendous work on various threats posed by illicit actors. My colleagues and I here at Treasury continue to benefit from your excellent analysis and research on a regular basis. And Matt, specifically the work you've been doing on Hezbollah and that worldwide map that you put out earlier this summer is just terrific work. So thanks for your contribution to our efforts here. It's an honor to be here today to discuss with you the tools that the Treasury Department is deploying to counter evolving national security threats. But before I offer some remarks on that subject, I thought it would be important to remind everybody of how we got here today. The founders of the Washington Institute established your organization 45 years ago to advance security and peace and prosperity and democracy across the Middle East. And they also recognized that effective policy to spread these values needed to be informed by the realities on the ground. At Treasury, we share those same goals of promoting democracy, stability, and transparency, not just in the Middle East, but all across the world. And we understand that we must be clear-eyed about the threats that we face to formulate policy and achieve our goals. As I mentioned, the Washington Institute has been a tremendous resource to our efforts to evaluate these threats. And so thank you for giving me the opportunity to recognize your contributions and join you in supporting security, peace, and democracy. I come to you today from Treasury's Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, or what we call TFI. TFI has a long and meaningful history of combating illicit finance and promoting financial transparency. As former Undersecretary Sigal Mandelker used to highlight, TFI has its roots in the Treasury's efforts to prevent Nazis from taking control of US-held assets in Nazi-invaded countries in Europe. But like the Washington Institute, Treasury changed in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. TFI was brought into existence after 9/11 and took its current form in the years following the attacks. So after 9/11, the US government greatly expanded the Treasury Department's role and authorities to target terrorists and their financiers all across the world. I understand that the Washington Institute similarly pivoted to focus on Islamic extremists, terrorism, and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. The government's expanded effort has now revolutionized Treasury's ability to identify and target not just terrorists, but other bad actors who want to abuse the global financial system. Today, TFI is comprised of four main components. The Office of Foreign Asset Control, or OFAC, which, as you all know, administers and enforces our various economic sanctions. The Office of Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes, or TFFC, which leads our international engagement efforts, and Treasury's efforts at the Financial Action Task Force. There's also the Office of Intelligence and Analysis, or OIA. Matt, you know that very well. OIA is Treasury's own financial intelligence unit and a member of the intelligence community. And finally, there's FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, which helps to collect and analyze financial information and identify bad actors. These four components all work together to protect the national security of the United States and our allies, and to safeguard the U.S. and international financial system from abuse. It's funny, we're almost 20 years after 9/11, but TFI continues to evolve, and our authorities have become among the top non-kinetic national security tools of choice for the United States government. Treasury continues to use its tools to counter terrorists and their financial networks. And I'll speak to you about some of those efforts and that focus in a moment. But today I want to try to highlight how we also use those same tools now to address the illicit finance activities of corrupt government officials, human rights abusers, and other bad actors. As Treasury has evolved, so too have our adversaries. So we've also expanded our focus to include illicit finance risks related to digital assets, including ransomware payments and the use of cryptocurrencies to promote illegal activity. Sanctions are a key component and tool, but TFI is also using other tools, including extensive international and private sector engagement and greatly increased financial intelligence, with great success to achieve long-term strategic goals. So today, I'd like to highlight a few of those tools and our successes. First, it's not possible to discuss TFI's tools in the threat landscape without talking about Treasury's counterterrorism efforts. TFI's new and expanded toolkit was developed in the aftermath of 9/11, and we have been applying our economic authorities at a rapid pace to cut off and disrupt funding for terrorist groups. As a former counterterrorism prosecutor at the Department of Justice, I grew up working on the investigation and prosecution of al-Qaeda operatives and ISIS jihadists who were plotting terrorist attacks against the West. And I knew that Treasury was in the lead on working to prevent the flow of funds to these groups. But what I did not appreciate is how active a role that Treasury plays in the National Security Council and with our colleagues at the State Department. And I've also learned how active a role that Treasury plays in the international community with our foreign counterparts across the world. And thanks to the incredible and focused work at TFI, including international cooperation like the Counter ISIS Finance Group, Treasury and the international community have decimated the financial backbone and resources of ISIS. Treasury also continues to target al-Qaeda's financial facilitators across the globe. Just this past October, Treasury imposed sanctions on an Australian-based businessman and his gemstone company for helping al-Qaeda move money across the globe to sustain its operations. And in July, Treasury sanctioned 2 key ISIS facilitators in Turkey and Syria. Despite the successes of the counterterrorism program against Al-Qaeda and ISIS, Treasury has not and will never take its eyes off those groups. Of course, Treasury's actions have also kept up maximum pressure on the Iranian regime and disrupted its ability to support terrorist groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon and elsewhere. We remain focused on these terrorist groups as they continue to evolve and adapt to maintain sources of revenue and channels to move funds. Treasury will continue to work together with our international partners to ensure that terrorists cannot exploit the international financial system to support their destabilizing goals. It should come as no surprise to anybody that Treasury is focused on combating terrorists and their financial networks. But it may surprise some of you that another key and important national security threat that TFI and other members of the international community are now focusing our economic and financial tools on is human rights abusers and corrupt public officials. Human rights violators and corrupt actors misuse and abuse the U.S. and international financial systems. This abuse of the financial system is not just destructive to people's lives, it also undermines local governments, global economic development, and the rule of law. It fuels conflict, destabilization, and mass atrocities. And corruption and human rights abuses are themselves the wellspring of terrorist ideology. Over the past few years, TFI has demonstrated its resolve to identify and hold accountable human rights abusers, facilitators of human trafficking, and corrupt actors who undermine peace, stability, and the rule of law. TFI uses all our economic tools to identify, address, and remediate underlying vulnerabilities in financial systems that enable corruption and human rights abuse. Our financial tools are a central element of the U.S. government's broader efforts to pressure authoritarian regimes and impose costs on insiders who exploit their official positions to commit human rights abuses, undermine democracy, and engage in other illicit activities. In fact, roughly half of Treasury's sanctions programs include criteria for sanctioning persons engaged in human rights abuses or corruption. So, for example, just yesterday, Treasury sanctioned 2 Iranian officials for their role in the abduction and detention of Bob Levinson under an executive order related to human rights abuses by Iran that was issued way back in 2010. Treasury's use of economic tools to go after human rights abuses and corruption is not a new phenomenon, but with the passage of the Global Magnitsky Act of 2016 and the subsequent implementing executive order, Treasury has helped to lead the effort to specifically target perpetrators of serious human rights abuses and corruption worldwide. The Global Magnitsky Act expanded a prior Russia-focused law, the Sergei Magnitsky Rule of Law Accountability Act of 2012. That legislation was intended to identify and punish the individuals responsible for the death of Sergei Magnitsky and other gross human rights violations in Russia. But since the passage of the Magnitsky Act in 2016 and the signing of the Global Magnitsky Executive Order in 2017, Treasury has aggressively used this authority to counter serious human rights abusers and their networks. So far, Treasury has designated over 240 corrupt actors and serious human rights abusers pursuant to our global Magnitsky authorities, or what we commonly refer to now as GLOMAG. Just last week, in conjunction with International Anti-Corruption and Human Rights Days, Treasury designated 26 individuals and entities pursuant to our GLOMAG authorities. These targets span the globe, including security and intelligence officials in Yemen, a former customs official in Kyrgyzstan, and former security officials in Haiti. The global nature of these targets illustrates that corruption and human rights abuses know no borders, and these actions make clear that neither do U.S. sanctions. One individual targeted in these actions was South Asia-based Wan Kwok Koi, also known as Broken Tooth. Broken Tooth was a member of the Chinese Communist Party and a leader of the 14K Triad. Some of you may know that the 14K Triad is one of the largest triad organizations in the world and engages in drug trafficking, illegal gambling, racketeering, human trafficking, and a whole host of other criminal activities. Treasury also designated 3 entities owned or controlled by Mr. Broken Tooth in Palau, China, and Cambodia. Broken Tooth used one of these companies, the Worldwide Hongmen History and Cultural Association, to paper over his illicit activities by framing their actions in terms of major Chinese Communist Party initiatives. Matt, as you know, we've also used our GLOMAG authorities in the Middle East. In November, Treasury designated Gibran Bassil, president of the Lebanese Free Patriotic Movement political party and a member of parliament there in Lebanon, for his role in corruption there. Bassil has consistently taken advantage of Lebanon's broken political system to advance his own interests. He embodies the Lebanese political establishment's corruption and mismanagement that protesters have rallied against for the past year. Meanwhile, the political party that Bassil leads, the Free Patriotic Movement, is closely aligned with Hezbollah. Treasury's actions illustrate this country's support for the Lebanese people and their call for reform and accountability in their government. In addition to our designations, Treasury and the United States have been leading the charge for our international partners to implement and expand their own anti-corruption and human rights sanctions regimes. We've worked intensely with our partners and nations around the world to encourage the adoption of similar laws so that we can create a powerful framework to support human rights and halt corruption all across the globe. In the last few months, we've seen developments in sanctions programs from the United Kingdom and most recently in the EU. Last Thursday, the UK imposed sanctions on 11 security figures and current and former government officials from Russia, Venezuela, Pakistan, and Gambia. And on December 7th, the EU implemented its own global human rights sanctions regime. These new sanctions regimes allow nations to identify and disrupt access to their financial systems by human rights abusers and their networks. And so we look forward to our continued cooperation with our allies in combating human rights abuses. Let me give you just one more example of our efforts in support of human rights here from Treasury and TFI. And here I want to focus on our efforts to end human trafficking, or what many refer to as a modern form of human slavery. Treasury has historically treated human trafficking as not only an illicit finance threat, but also as a human rights and corruption issue. At Treasury, we see how human trafficking is fueled by conflict and goes hand in hand with corrupt leadership. In October, the U.S. government released a national action plan to combat human trafficking. Treasury has committed to leveraging its economic tools to target, disrupt, and counter those who undermine American values and engage in human trafficking. We'll also support government-wide investigations and engage with our financial sector partners on illicit finance activities related to human trafficking. I've spoken a great deal about our counterterrorism and human rights and anti-corruption efforts. But so much of our work at TFI happens when we regularly participate in ongoing and productive conversations with the private sector on a wide range of illicit finance issues. We truly depend on the private sector and our public-private partnerships to share information and effectively implement our policies to mitigate illicit finance threats. As part of this cooperative relationship, TFI regularly meets with private sector entities to explain our sanctions regulations and actions, share information on illicit activity, and discuss best practices. Based on robust laws, practices, and these regular financial engagements, financial institutions all across the globe have erected their own safeguards in their own financial systems to prevent malign actors from abusing their networks. And those same institutions are happy to share that information directly back with the government. This dialogue creates a really productive, positive, circular feedback loop in which we can share with the broader financial community the typologies from these exchanges, enabling other financial institutions to identify and report similar illicit activity. To continue and promote this positive feedback loop, Treasury has been issuing more advisories to help the private sector identify and prioritize threats and key corrupt activity and human rights violations. So, for example, in July 2020, the Treasury Department joined together with other executive agencies to issue a business advisory on supply chain issues related to forced labor and human rights abuses in Xinjiang, China. And in October 2020, FinCEN published an advisory focusing on human traffickers' use of money laundering tactics to evade detection, hide their proceeds, and grow their criminal enterprises. Civil society organizations are another critical partner for TFI. Last month, Treasury hosted the second annual Partnership to Combat Human Rights Abuses and Corruption, which brought together NGOs, the financial industry, and government partners to discuss emerging issues and challenges in our shared battle against human rights abusers and corrupt government officials. NGOs have provided much needed context for the private sector to understand human rights and corruption risks in our supply chains and to help identify new means and methods that human rights abusers and corrupt actors are using to exploit the international financial system. I've already mentioned international engagement in our battle to combat ISIS and international terrorism, but it's worth highlighting here the extensive engagement from TFI at the FATF and our use of the FATF to combat evolving threats. Last year, the United States had the honor to lead the FATF, and I want to highlight two important initiatives and their impact on the international financial community. First, the FATF expanded an international standard on illicit finance risks to cover counter-proliferation financing, including the risk of breach or evasion of United Nations sanctions. This is important because it means that financial institutions will now be required to identify and assess the risk that their networks are being abused not just by terrorists or money launderers, but also by individuals and entities from places like North Korea and Iran, who are sanctioned by the United Nations and involved in the spread of weapons of mass destruction. Second, The FATF also clarified that the international standards against money laundering and terrorist financing apply to financial activities involving virtual currencies. These efforts to update and modernize our international standards are critical, as illicit actors are constantly looking for ways to raise and transfer funds without detection or tracking by law enforcement. So, for example, malicious actors have targeted critical sectors amid the COVID-19 pandemic, increasing the threat of ransomware attacks, which often involve payments in cryptocurrencies. To address this threat, TFI released advisories from both OFAC and FinCEN, addressing the illicit finance risks of ransomware and giving the private sector tools to combat it. Additionally, Treasury worked with the rest of the G7 under the U.S. presidency to publish a statement on ransomware. The statement, among other things, declares that the G7 intends to take coordinated, tangible actions against ransomware going forward. As you can see, TFI and the Treasury Department have aggressively used a wide range of tools and authorities to identify and target a wide range of illicit actors for their abuse of the global financial system. These tools and authorities are persuasive and they are powerful, and they play a critical role in an active and assertive economic and U.S. foreign policy. To be sure, the complexity and sophistication of these tools have greatly increased, but so have our targets, and so has the geopolitical and geoeconomic environment of the 21st century. This morning, I've had the chance to speak with you about how TFI is using these tools against the evolving threat from human rights abusers and corrupt government officials. But we are witnessing right now the rise of great power competition and the growing effort to use these tools in this new and challenging and evolving environment. I've touched on some of those efforts this morning, but that subject is probably better left to a future conversation. In the meantime, I can assure you that TFI and the Treasury Department will continue to work closely with the international community and the private sector to address these challenges and to ensure, to the greatest extent possible, that our tools are appropriately measured, calibrated, and responsive to the scope of all of the threats before us. So thank you, Matt, for letting me give that address, and I look forward to any questions that you or other folks have on the line.
Carter, thank you so much for that introductory statement. Really covered a lot of waterfront there. Let me go back to the very beginning. You mentioned that both TFI and the Washington Institute kind of changed their focus a little bit after 9/11. I actually was honored to be a part of both of those changes. As you mentioned, when I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Intelligence in OIA. Now we're at another watershed moment in terms of COVID-19, both in terms of how adversaries are taking advantage of the crisis, including by terrorist actors. Treasury's taken action against, and DOJ have taken action against ISIS and Hamas PPE fraud cases. But I wonder if you could start us off by taking a step back and just telling us what it's like in the department right now to work under COVID conditions. I remember when I was there, Treasury was called upon all the time for everything, it seemed. We needed to find an extra 1 and 2 hours to slip into the day, 25-hour days. I imagine that working under COVID conditions has been unique at a time when the department's authorities are under particular demand. What's it like within TFI right now?
Well, it's no doubt that the COVID-19 pandemic has been challenging for everyone, not just here in TFI and the government, but all over the world. Um, I joined the department this summer in the midst of the pandemic. Um, and I can, it has been challenging, but I think we had a TFI town hall just a couple weeks ago. And I think everybody in the building recognized the incredible effort and commitment that everybody across TFI has demonstrated in rising to the challenge of continuing to use all our tools and help support the national security mission of the United States. And it makes me two of the key things that I've noticed in my time here with TFI is I kind of say two words for it. First is mission, that the folks here in TFI have an incredible commitment to the mission of protecting and defending our national security. And even in the challenges of COVID, especially in an environment where you're working with classified materials so much and you've got to come into the building, you've got to use different networks. It's been incredible to watch these committed public servants help promote and defend the mission of the United States. The other thing that I've really been so impressed by is also, and I think it goes hand in hand with the mission, is the professionalism that folks have shown. Perhaps it's a little bit reflective of my prior service in the United States Senate, but here at Treasury and TFI, my colleagues just show an incredible professionalism to engage in these issues and to make sure that we're appropriately using our financial tools, but that we're meeting the threat head on. So it has been a challenge, but because of those two great values, I think, of mission and professionalism, TFI has been rocking and rolling for the last 6 months.
Rocking and rolling on a bunch of things that people know about and some that people might not be as familiar with. So, for example, there's a current debate right now as to whether or not the Houthis should be designated as a foreign terrorist organization by the State Department. That's a state issue, not a Treasury issue. But can you speak to a moment to what a decision like that means, how it affects the work of the Treasury Department? In particular, I'm thinking of the monumental task of trying to put together the kind of waivers and licenses that would be necessary if it were to happen, so that international NGOs can still function and so that famine, for example, can hopefully be averted if this goes forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's amazing how many challenging issues come across our desks here at TFI every day. Certainly that's one of them. Our commitment to trying to ensure that we protect the financial system from abuse by illicit actors in Yemen, and at the same time trying to balance our humanitarian goals and responsibilities, our responsibilities to the financial institutions who may be trying to be active in Yemen. So we see that all across the world. It's not just Yemen. Think about the challenges that we have right now in Iraq and Syria and Lebanon. So every single day there are a host of challenges, and trying to balance those competing interests is really one of the privileges and honors of being here at TFI.
So you talked about the expansion of Treasury's authorities, and we've talked about how Treasury is being relied upon more and more for ever widening array of issue sets. Do you have concerns about the downsides or the risks of this dramatic expansion and the use of sanctions as tools of economic and national security statecraft? And before you answer that, I'll just remind our viewers that you can submit questions to policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. Policyforum, one word, @washingtoninstitute.org. Go ahead, Corey.
Well, thanks, Matt. That's another, great and enduring question that I think TFI has been facing for, several years as we continue to apply our authorities to a broader set of problems, as we enter into testing our tools and authorities in support of great power competition. It puts additional pressures on the international financial system. I think we're all extremely mindful that the power of our authorities relies on the fact that the international financial system is dollar-based, and that we have to be mindful of that our actions can have consequences that will affect that. And I think that's why, as I mentioned at the end of my address, it's just critically important that our tools are calibrated, and that we engage with the international community, that we engage with the private sector to make sure that we're taking appropriate steps as we exercise those tools.
Great. Let me ask you a little bit about the GLOMAG, Global Magnitsky authorities that you highlighted on targeting human rights abuse and corruption. One of the questions we've gotten in asks about ultimately how effective they are. I'd be interested to hear cases where Magnitsky sanctions have been effective in changing behavior, maybe resulting in delisting, or have they seen a deterrent effect? In other words, what is the actual impact of these actions targeting actors from Kyrgyzstan to Venezuela and almost everywhere in between?
That's a great question. It's something that we also contemplate when we're taking action, is that we want to make sure that our tools are not just part of a messaging campaign, that they have a real impact and that they can change behavior. So I know that my predecessor spent a lot of time working on GLOMAG authorities in Africa. And I think in the Central African Republic, there's been significant positive steps as a result of the application of our authorities there. I like to think that even the action just recently in support of Human Rights and Corruption Day, Anti-Human Rights Abuse and Corruption Day, had an incredibly positive impact across the international community. And you saw steps being taken in some of those countries in the media to support our actions and demand for actions in the local communities. That, to me, is the way that our authorities are best applied, when we can make sure that our local communities are applying them too, that it's not just the United States imposing its will externally.
And do you see opportunity for greater joint designations like these? The EU now has a GLOMAG type law. The UK has a GLOMAG type law. You mentioned that in your comments. But so far, these actions tend to be unilateral by us or by them. Do you see efforts to make this more multilateral?
I absolutely do. And I think the important thing to remember is how nascent these authorities are. And so, I think you're going to see much more collaboration. I was on the phone recently with the Canadian minister in charge of these authorities. I was over in the UK recently talking with them about how we can work together. That's going to take time. And certainly COVID has not been helpful in facilitating greater international cooperation. But I'm really optimistic about our ability to apply a more international consensus in this space of human rights and corruption.
I think most people aren't aware that over the past couple of years, I think maybe almost as much as 50% of Treasury's actions have been in the space of human rights and corruption. Am I right?
You are. I think, in my address, I said that, I think more than 240 actions in the last couple of years. I mean, really, like, this is a 2016 authority. The executive order implementing it wasn't enacted until 2017. That's how new these authorities are. Although I'm also reminded that it's not like Treasury has just been focused on that human rights haven't been a focus of our prior sanctions programs. And I think about Cuba or Iran or North Korea or other areas too. They've always been a part of it. But I think this is a specific authority. And I think the United States government and the State Department, we're working well. We're working well with NGOs to try and figure out how best to apply these authorities. We've all been set back in a way by the last 9 months in COVID, but I'm really optimistic about what we can do if we use these authorities, especially with the international community.
So you mentioned towards the end of your remarks the issue of global great power competition. I like to challenge the notion that great power competition, counterterrorism, for example, are completely different issue sets. To me, there's a tremendous amount of Venn diagram overlap. And I think about that when I think about the use of GLOMAG tools in particular. So if we could focus, for example, on a place like Iraq, where we have multiple different types of interests, is there a space, maybe a particularly useful space for global Magnitsky type of actions in Iraq that highlight corruption, human rights abuses, and not only some of the other things like terrorism that are maybe more controversial, and that perhaps by highlighting some of the illicit actions that some parties are engaged in could in some ways help the political process along?
I hope so. I hope that's what we're, that's, as I noted in my remarks, our action against Gibran Bassil in Lebanon was intended to support the Lebanese people and to highlight the corruption, the endemic systemic corruption. And certainly, as you know, the overlapping threat from terrorism there in Lebanon, it is, these are not entirely separate problems. Corruption and human rights abuses and terrorism all can go together. I think, we at the Treasury Department, we at TFI have been concerned about corruption in Iraq and have been taking steps to try and address that. And we will always look to use our authorities in appropriate ways with the support of our colleagues at the State Department to have an impact. And I think we're going to see that in Lebanon. And I think other places like Iraq may be potential avenues for GLOMAG authorities too.
So in Lebanon is a good example to follow up on this. We've seen some recent actions taken under counterterrorism authorities that have also mentioned corruption. And we've seen some, like the designation of Gibran Bassil, being taken under anti-corruption GLOMAG authorities, but are also mentioning terrorism, for example, the FPM's close ties, Bassil's own close ties to Hezbollah. Can you talk us through the type of discussion calculation that goes into making a decision of when to use one authority or another when there's more than one authority that might apply?
I sure can. Some of this has to do with the state of information. So, from your work here at the Treasury Department, oftentimes we're working with classified material, and sometimes the sensitivities of that material means that we can't use it in support of actions. Other times we may want to use an authority because of the consequences that it has. So for instance, we have been using our counterterrorism designations in the context of Iran lately as an effort to highlight the fact that Iran's support for terrorist organizations and the close ties between the regime and terrorist activity. So other times, I think, for instance, with Basile, we wanted to highlight the systemic corruption rather than any ties to counterterrorism. And so I think it's a great tool to have. And as I remarked, previously we have authorities that allow us in our country programs to target serious human rights abuses. So it's a problem that we've had a lot, and we have different ways to address it.
So Carter, you mentioned in your remarks also that while Treasury engages in all kinds of sanctions activities, it engages in a lot of other activities too. I'd like to ask you a couple of questions about the role of sanctions diplomacy. How important is it to have Treasury engage on a technical basis with foreign finance and central bank officials when it comes specifically to sanctions design and implementation? So without kind of crossing over into the role that is more traditionally State Department, I want to focus on some of the Treasury specific areas of sanctions diplomacy.
Well, we spend an incredible amount of time, and particularly, TFFC, with the heads of central banks from across the world and foreign financial institutions as well, in trying to make sure that our sanctions authorities are properly calibrated and measured so that we're not having unintended consequences. And if we're going to have the right impact and we're going to make sure that we're targeting what we want, the effect that we want, the best way to do that is by directly engaging with other finance ministries from around the world and also foreign financial institutions. It's not just our own domestic banks, but also foreign banks that are mindful of our actions. And we can't be effective unless we're doing that engagement.
I'd like to ask you about sanctions diplomacy in one particular kind of cutting edge area. Digital payment systems have rapidly expanded in places like China, and there are many risks associated with its international expansion. Can you talk about Treasury's role in digital payment systems, not just digital currencies, in terms of private sector and international engagement?
Well, I tried to mention some of that effort at the FATF recently, and making sure not just the FATF, but the G7, it's something that the Secretary has been extremely mindful of and engaged in. And FinCEN is incredibly active in this space of regulating and keeping track of the use of cryptocurrencies or digital assets or digital payment systems, really mindful of what's going on with Libra or Diem. PayPal just recently announced a new effort that we've been mindful of. So, this is the future of financial technology, and we are we want to be supportive of innovation and expanding financial inclusion. But this raises concerns about money laundering and terrorist financing. And I think these are challenges, and we're all walking this path together right now.
Does it also raise concerns about the potential for people to be engaging in international finance outside a dollarized economy? And that if that were to increase significantly over the next decade or two, that might undermine some of the impact of US financial tools, which, as you mentioned earlier, are in large part so effective because so much of the international financial system is dollarized.
Absolutely. That's why it's critical that Treasury is mindful of the AML, CFT consequences and sanctions risks associated with the creation of a financial system that is untethered to, our long background of BSA compliance and sanctions compliance. So we have been working diligently and mindfully to make sure that those shared values and international standards are applied across the board.
Do we have too many sanctions programs? I think, for example, there was one particularly controversial action this year targeting the ICC. Do we have too many sanctions programs? And are there areas where maybe you could use additional tools?
Too many is there are a lot of sanctions programs. They continue developing over time. I like to recall in this space that sanctions programs are not just the creature of the executive branch. I think there is sometimes a complaint recently of executive overreach or unilateralism, but a lot of the recent sanctions programs are the product of wide bipartisan consensus by the United States Congress. I think about CATSA. I think about the Caesar Act, the Hong Kong Autonomy Act, and I'm sure I'm leaving some out. GLOMAG. Look at GLOMAG is the product of congressional action and support. So, I think we are recognizing that sanctions can have an incredibly potent impact. I think the NDAA was full at one point in time of a host of other sanctions programs. So the consequences of a greatly expanded sanctions platform are significant. We are very mindful that sanctions ultimately deny or prevent U.S. companies from engaging in activity across the world. We don't want to be in the business of doing that unless we really need to.
Let me ask you about one of those sanctions programs that came from Congress, Caesar Act, and about Syria sanctions more generally. How effective do you see U.S. sanctions targeting the Assad regime, given the fact that the Assad regime seems to be, in some ways, painful though it may be to say it, winning?
Well, sanctions, right. So we have been rolling out sanctions repeatedly to address the Assad regime and its abuse of its people and human rights abuses there, to try and deny financial support to the regime, to target international actors who are lending their financial support to the regime. It is an extremely challenging space. I don't know that sanctions are the solution always, but the alternative seems worse to me. And, it's strong bipartisan support across the international community for denying the Assad regime financial winnings. Those actions have been incredibly important, and I think will continue.
Yeah, I like to tell people actually that sanctions will never solve your problem alone, but when used in tandem with other tools, they can be rather effective. Let me ask about another major program involved that deals with Iran, the maximum pressure campaign has hurt Iran's economy. There's no denying that. But it does not seem to have curbed Iran's nuclear program. which is more advanced now than it was 4 years ago, or its regional malign activities, targeting targets in Saudi Arabia, etc., both of which have expanded since the United States pulled out of the JCPOA and maximum pressure campaign started. Earlier this year, senior State Department official said that Iran was still able to provide Hezbollah somewhere around $700 million a year. So in what ways has the maximum pressure campaign been successful?
I think the maximum pressures campaign has been incredibly successful at denying support to the Iranian regime and in particularly its terrorist proxies across the world. I think it has been remarkable how successful the consistent economic pressure has been on the regime. And I think that, the other thing that I think is important to recognize is these are long-term historical challenges. And it's hard not to look at the maximum pressure campaign without looking at the other incredible changes in the Middle East over the last few months. And here, I mean the Abraham Accords. So an incredible realignment is going on in the Middle East. And I think historians and other actors will try and evaluate whether the maximum pressure campaign contributed to that. But I think it's not appropriate to look at the maximum pressure campaign in isolation alone.
Great. So looking forward, how do you see the development of Treasury's authorities as tools of coercive economic statecraft? I mean, what are some of these evolving threats that we discussed in the title of this event that TFI now has to contend with? I'm thinking, for example, about the many different aspects of illicit finance that China is involved in, the department's actions regarding Russia in particular, involving election interference, for example.
Yeah, it's election interference is a extremely challenging and important national security subject. I remember when I joined the department, I got to sit with one of the founders of TFI, and he asked me what I was spending a lot of time on, and I explained that election security was a significant focus, and he kind of it caught him off guard that the institution that he helped to create was now focused on election security. And, I think we all think Iran or even pivoting to China. And I think as my remarks today meant to emphasize, look, we're doing an incredible amount of activity in, human rights and corruption. But there are new challenges that we're being asked to use our tools, cyber interference, and as part of that is election security. And I think we've been effective in using our authorities in that space as well.
So I think we have time for one last question. We spent a lot of time talking about Treasury's authorities looking at illicit finance abroad, but of course we have our own issues at home. Last week, the Senate passed the beneficial ownership rules as part of the National Defense Authorization Act to address the use of shell companies, which, to be blunt, has been a really big problem in this country. How important is the beneficial ownership rule passage to you where you sit and Treasury TFI?
I think it's incredibly important, and it's an incredible victory for everybody in the financial community and who has been pushing for this legislation for 10, 12, 15 years. It's going to bring the United States, we always tout ourselves as one of the leaders, if not the preeminent country in the world to combat money laundering and terrorist financing. And this plugs an incredibly significant hole in our own laws, the FATF has been consistently mindful of our own challenges here. So, the financial community has been addressing these problems through their customer due diligence and KYC obligations for some time. And I'm confident that our business community is going to be able to adapt to these new rules. But this is an incredibly significant development, an incredible victory for folks on the Hill and people in this building who have been working incredibly hard for years and years and years to see this legislation get across the finish line. So we're really excited about that.
Well, congratulations to those at Treasury and the many people outside U.S. government who worked so hard to push this through. I agree. I think it's a really important milestone. I know if we were able to get together in person, there'd be a round of applause right now. I know everybody joins me in thanking you, Carter, for taking the time to engage in such a robust discussion with us on such a wide array of issues. And I want to thank you and thank all the people working at Treasury's TFI for the hard work they're doing. I want to wish you and all of our participants a very happy holiday season, a very happy new year. And thank you so much for taking the time. Have a great day.
Thanks for